How did you react when you caught your best friend having an affair? When I was 15, my best friend started dating my adopted sister, Indy. He asked her out in front of my whole family at the dinner table, a ballsy move our dad actually appreciated. For 6 months, Maverick was a great boyfriend, driving her to and from school, making her feel loved, and relentlessly teasing me about how he was cracking someone in my family. Then I started noticing something strange. I came downstairs one night around midnight to grab water. The kitchen light was on. Maverick and my 18-year-old sister Scarlett were standing really close to each other by the counter, talking quietly. The second I walked in, they jumped apart. Scarlett's face went red. Maverick immediately said he was just leaving and ran out the front door. I asked Scarlett what that was about. She said they were just talking about Indy's birthday present. 2 weeks later, Maverick started coming over way more often. He'd show up for family dinners even when Indy had to work late. He'd always find a reason to sit next to Scarlett at the table. He'd ask her about her college classes and her friends. Meanwhile, Indy would be sitting on his other side and he barely looked at her. I noticed, but I didn't say anything because I thought maybe I was being paranoid. Then I came home early from the gym one afternoon. Maverick's car was in our driveway, but Indy wasn't home. I walked inside and Maverick came out of the hallway looking surprised to see me. He said he was just using the bathroom and waiting for Indy. I asked why he didn't just go home and wait there. He got this attitude and said, "What's your problem, man?" Then he left. At our family BBQ the next weekend, I saw Maverick and Scarlett walk around the side of the house together. I didn't think much of it at first, but 15 minutes went by and they still weren't back. When they finally came back, Scarlett's face was all red and Maverick wouldn't look at me. That's when Indy pulled me aside. She asked if I noticed anything weird about Maverick lately. She said he'd been really distant with her. He was always on his phone texting someone. When she asked who, he'd get defensive. Then everything exploded. Indy found Maverick's phone unlocked one night. She saw he'd been texting Scarlett every single day, hundreds of messages. She confronted him and he said they were just friends. He told Indy she was being insecure and jealous. Indy came to me crying. She showed me some of the texts. They weren't inappropriate, but they were constant. Good morning. Good night. Asking about her day. Indy confronted Scarlett directly. She asked her straight up if something was going on with Maverick. Scarlett swore nothing was happening. She said Maverick was just being friendly because he was dating Indy. She asked Indy if she really thought a college student would be interested in a 15-year-old high school freshman. Then Scarlett stormed upstairs and locked herself in her room. Maverick came to me the next day acting like he was the victim. He said Indy was ruining their relationship with her jealousy. He asked if I could talk to Indy and tell her to calm down. He said he was just trying to be part of our family. I practically slapped him over the back of the head. I told him he needed to back off from Scarlett, that if I found out he was doing anything with her, he'd need to answer to the coroner. He got in my face about it. I'm dating your sister. I'm part of the family now. Stop being weird about it. Then yesterday happened. Maverick and I were in health and safety class, getting ready for a police officer to come in and give a talk about gang violence. Suddenly I saw Maverick 2 rows ahead of me. He was staring at his phone with this huge smile on his face. His cheeks were completely red. He was leaning forward in his seat like he was looking at something he really liked and had one hand in his pocket. I got up to throw something away and walked right past his desk. I peered into his phone to see what he was looking at, thinking I'd see pictures of Scarlett and finally catch him in the act. Instead, I found something much worse. You see, Scarlett was 18, but she was also a mother to a 2-year-old daughter. She was raising her in our house because the dad was nowhere to be found. The pictures I saw Maverick excitedly looking at were of the 2-year-old daughter. Her in her crib, her in her nappy. Scarlett changing her when she thought nobody was looking. I wanted to get sick, to start punching him and not stop until his face was level with the classroom floor. I tapped his shoulder and felt him literally drain of color. He looked up. Our eyes met. I balled my fist up and started swinging wildly at Maverick. That's when the police officer suddenly walked into the classroom, the principal beside him. Principal Cox grabbed my arm mid-swing and yanked it backward so hard I stumbled. Officer Gallegos moved fast across the room toward Maverick, who scrambled backward out of his desk chair with his phone clutched against his chest like it was the most important thing in the world. The health teacher started shouting for everyone to stay in their seats, but nobody listened. The entire classroom exploded into chaos with students jumping up and pulling out their phones to record everything. Some kids were yelling, asking what was happening. Others were backing away from me and Maverick like we had a disease. I was breathing so hard my chest hurt, and my knuckles were already swelling up red and angry. All I could think about were those pictures of Thea in her crib that I just saw on his screen. Her little face, her in her diaper, Scarlett changing her when she thought nobody was watching. Officer Gallegos got between me and Maverick and held up both hands. He told us both to calm down right now. Principal Cox still had my arm in a death grip, and she was asking what on earth was going on here. Maverick started crying, actual tears running down his face as he looked at the principal and the officer. He said I attacked him for no reason, that I was crazy and jealous because he was dating my sister. His voice got all high and shaky like he was the victim here. Officer Gallegos separated us to opposite sides of the classroom. He put me near the windows and Maverick by the door. I was shaking, but not from fear. From rage and disgust so strong I wanted to throw up. I wanted to tell everyone right then what I saw. Wanted to scream it so the whole school would know what kind of person Maverick really was. But I knew those images were evidence of something so much worse than a fight. If I said it out loud right now, he might delete everything before the police could see. So I kept my mouth shut and stared at him across the room. Principal Cox was demanding to know what happened. The health teacher tried to explain that I just started hitting Maverick out of nowhere during class, that there was no argument or anything before it. Maverick kept crying and saying he didn't do anything wrong. Officer Gallegos looked between us like he was trying to figure out what was really going on here. Principal Cox told the health teacher to keep the other students in the room. Then she grabbed my shoulder and told me to come with her. Officer Gallegos took Maverick by the arm. We walked out into the hallway with the principal leading the way and the officer following behind us. Officer Gallegos was speaking quietly into his radio about needing backup. My mind was racing about whether to tell them everything right now or wait. Whether Maverick had already deleted the photos somehow. Whether I should have grabbed his phone instead of hitting him. The walk through the hallways felt like it took forever. Students were everywhere between classes, and they all stopped to stare and whisper when they saw us. 2 kids being escorted by the principal and a cop. Phones came out. People started recording. I heard someone say my name. Someone else asked if that was Maverick. I realized this moment was about to change everything for my entire family. Once I told them what I saw, there was no going back. Scarlett would have to know. Indy would have to know. Mom and Dad would have to know. Everyone would know what Maverick had been doing in our house. We got to the principal's office and she unlocked the door. Officer Gallegos asked for both our phones right away. He told us to sit in separate corners while we wait for his sergeant to arrive. I handed mine over without arguing. Maverick hesitated for just a second before pulling his phone out of his pocket. His hands were shaking as he gave it to the officer. Then he sat down in the corner by the filing cabinets. I sat in the opposite corner by the bookshelf. Maverick kept glancing at his phone in Officer Gallegos' hand. I could see him trying to figure out if he could delete the evidence before they looked. His eyes kept darting between the officer and the phone. He was probably wondering if they needed a warrant or if they could just look through it right now. I caught his eye across the room. He went completely pale. All the color drained out of his face in like 2 seconds. He understood that I knew exactly what he was trying to do and why I attacked him. The office got really quiet except for Principal Cox typing on her computer and Officer Gallegos talking low into his radio. A female police sergeant showed up maybe 10 minutes later. She knocked on the door and came in wearing a regular police uniform with sergeant stripes. She introduced herself, but I don't remember her name because my brain was going too fast. She asked Principal Cox if there was a private room where she could interview us separately. Maverick's hands were shaking worse now as he clutched his phone. Wait, no. Officer Gallegos had his phone. Maverick's hands were just shaking in his lap. The sergeant noticed right away. She looked at him and asked him calmly to place his phone on the desk, but the officer already had it. She meant for Maverick to confirm it was his phone. Maverick hesitated for just a second too long before nodding. That hesitation told the officers everything they needed to know about his guilt. You could see it on their faces. The sergeant took me first to the school counselor's office down the hall. She sat down across from me and pulled out a notebook. She told me to start from the beginning and tell her everything, so I did. The words came out in a rush that didn't feel big enough for the horror of what I discovered. I explained the 6 months of weird behavior, the late-night kitchen thing with Scarlett, the constant texting, him always being at our house even when Indy wasn't there. Then I told her about today in class, about seeing him staring at his phone with that gross smile on his face, about walking past his desk and seeing the pictures of Thea in her crib, in her diaper, Scarlett changing her when she thought nobody was watching. The sergeant listened without interrupting. She took detailed notes the whole time I was talking. When I finished, she looked up at me. She said I did the right thing by reporting this right away, even though the physical assault makes things harder. She explained they were going to need to look at Maverick's phone with a warrant, that this was now a criminal investigation about possible child exploitation. She started asking really detailed questions about Thea's routine. Who has access to our house? Whether I noticed Maverick taking pictures before? That's when it hit me with this sick feeling in my stomach. I probably had seen him with his phone out around Thea before, lots of times, but I dismissed it as normal because everyone takes pictures of cute kids. I didn't understand what his actual goal was. I told the sergeant about all the times he was at our house, how he'd show up for dinner even when Indy had to work late, how he always found reasons to be upstairs near the bedrooms. The sergeant wrote everything down. 2 more officers showed up while I was still in the counseling office. I could hear them in the principal's office down the hall. I heard them reading Maverick his rights. His voice got really loud and defensive. He was claiming this was all a big misunderstanding, that I was lying because I never liked him dating Indy, that I was jealous or something. Principal Cox's voice came through the wall. She was on the phone. I heard her carefully explaining there had been an incident requiring police involvement, that parents needed to come to the school right away. She was trying not to alarm them too much over the phone, but you could hear the seriousness in her voice. My dad Tucker got there first. I saw him through the counseling office window walking fast down the hallway. His face was tight with worry that changed to confusion when he saw all the police cars outside. The sergeant left me in the counseling office and went to talk to him. I watched through the window as she took him aside and started explaining. I sat there feeling completely numb, like all the adrenaline from earlier just crashed and left me empty. Through the window, I could see Maverick being walked out to a police car in handcuffs. He was still protesting, still saying he didn't do anything wrong. Students were crowding the hallways with their phones out recording everything. This was going to be all over social media in like 5 minutes. Mom showed up maybe 10 minutes after Dad. I watched both my parents' faces as the sergeant explained what I discovered and why I attacked Maverick. Dad's expression went from confused to super mad to completely destroyed in just seconds. Mom started crying right away. She kept asking about Thea, whether she was safe, whether something had happened to her. The sergeant tried to reassure them. She said Thea was never in physical danger from what they knew so far, but they needed to look at all of Maverick's devices to figure out the full extent of what he'd been doing. The sergeant closed her notebook and looked at my parents. She needed to come to our house. She needed to interview Scarlett and examine Thea's room to understand how Maverick might have taken photos without being noticed. Mom pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called Scarlett. I could hear my sister's voice through the speaker asking what was wrong. Mom's voice broke as she tried to explain that Maverick had been arrested and they needed to come home right away, that it involved Thea. Scarlett's confusion turned to panic, and I could hear it even from across the room. She kept asking what happened to Thea, and Mom kept trying to say she was safe but needed to come home now. The call ended, and Mom just sat there staring at her phone. The sergeant stood up and said she'd meet us at the house in 30 minutes. She walked out to coordinate with the other officers. Principal Cox came into the counseling office next. She sat down across from me and explained that both Maverick and I were being suspended pending investigation. It felt completely unfair given what I discovered. She said it was mandatory policy for physical fights. Dad immediately argued that I was protecting my family and shouldn't be punished the same as a predator. Principal Cox's face looked tired. She said the school had to follow procedures. They'd review my case separately once the police investigation provided more information. I was being sent home with my parents. Maverick was being taken to the police station for formal questioning, and his parents were being called. Dad stood up and put his hand on my shoulder. We walked out of the counseling office together. Students were still in the hallways staring at their phones. I saw videos of Maverick being put in the police car playing on multiple screens as we passed. The drive home was completely silent, except for Mom's quiet crying in the passenger seat. Dad's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. I sat in the back seat feeling like I might throw up. Those images kept replaying in my head. Thea in her crib, Thea in her nappy, Scarlett changing her when she thought nobody was watching. I kept wondering how long Maverick had been doing this. How many times had he been in our house taking pictures? How many times had I seen him with his phone out and thought nothing of it? We pulled into the driveway and I saw Scarlett's car already there. She must have driven home from campus the second Mom called. I knew the next conversation was going to destroy her sense of safety in her own home. Nobody moved for a second. Then Dad opened his door and we all got out. Scarlett met us at the door with Thea on her hip. Her face was pale and she was demanding to know what was happening. What did Mom mean about Maverick being arrested? What did any of this have to do with Thea? Dad held up his hand and asked her to put Thea down for a nap first. This conversation wasn't appropriate for little ears. Scarlett's hands started shaking as she looked at all our faces. She turned and carried Thea upstairs. I could hear her singing a lullaby in a trembling voice while we waited in the living room. None of us could look at each other. Mom sat on the couch. Dad stood by the window. I stayed near the door. The singing stopped. We heard Scarlett's footsteps coming back down the stairs. She appeared in the doorway looking terrified. Mom made Scarlett sit down on the couch before explaining what I discovered on Maverick's phone. I watched my sister's face go through so many emotions I couldn't track them all. Confusion first, then disbelief, then horror as she started to understand. Denial next as she shook her head. Finally, this sick understanding came over her face as she remembered all the times Maverick was in the house without anyone watching him. She started breathing really fast. Dad had to get her a paper bag because she was hyperventilating. She kept repeating the same thing over and over. No, 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 like she could make it not true if she just said it enough times. Mom was crying and trying to hold Scarlett's hand. Dad paced back and forth across the living room. I just stood there feeling useless and horrible for being the one who had to tell her. Scarlett suddenly jumped up from the couch and ran upstairs. We heard her footsteps pounding down the hallway to the nursery. Then we heard her sobbing. Mom looked at Dad and he nodded at me to go check on her. I walked upstairs and found Scarlett in Thea's room. She was holding her sleeping daughter and crying, so hard her whole body was shaking. Then she put Thea back in the crib really carefully. She started examining the room like she was seeing it for the first time, looking at every angle, every corner, trying to figure out where someone could have taken photos without her noticing. She walked to the window and looked out. Then she looked back at the crib. Her face went even paler. She realized the crib was positioned right where someone could take pictures from outside the house. Maverick could have taken pictures from the driveway when he claimed to be waiting in his car for Indy. She sank down on the floor next to the crib and just kept crying. A car pulled up outside. I looked out the window and saw Detective Xavier Black getting out with 2 other officers and someone carrying a big camera bag. The forensic specialist. They came to the door and Mom let them in. Detective Black was maybe 40 with kind eyes but a serious face. He introduced himself and his team. They needed to photograph Thea's room from every angle. Scarlett came downstairs and the detective asked her to explain her daily routine. When did Maverick have access to the house? Where did Thea spend most of her time? Scarlett answered in this flat voice like she was in shock. The detective was gentle but thorough with his questions. Then he asked if Maverick ever volunteered to babysit or help with Thea. Scarlett's face changed. She remembered something. He had offered multiple times. She always said no. Something felt off about his eagerness. She started crying again, realizing her instinct probably saved her daughter from something much worse than photographs. The forensic specialist went upstairs with his camera. We could hear him moving around in Thea's room taking pictures. Then he went outside. Detective Black followed him. They were examining the exterior wall below Thea's window. The specialist pointed at something and took more photos. Detective Black came back inside holding evidence bags. He explained they found scuff marks on the wall suggesting someone climbed up to look inside. This supported the theory that Maverick was accessing the property without permission. Scarlett started crying harder. She kept saying she knew something was wrong. She knew she shouldn't trust him around Thea. Detective Black told her she did everything right by following her instincts. Her protective choices probably saved her daughter from direct contact abuse. The front door opened and Indy walked in. She was still wearing her work uniform from the grocery store. She stopped in the doorway, seeing all the police officers in our living room. She immediately started demanding to know why everyone was crying and why there were cops in Thea's room. Dad walked over to her. He tried to explain what Maverick was arrested for. Indy's first reaction was to defend him. She insisted there must be a mistake, that I was lying because I never liked their relationship. Her denial was so fierce that Mom had to physically grab her shoulders. Detective Black stepped forward and started explaining the evidence they'd found. Indy kept shaking her head and saying no. She refused to believe any of it. Detective Black pulled out his tablet. He showed Indy a photo log from Maverick's phone. Dozens of images of Thea taken over several months, some through windows, some from inside the house when he claimed to be using the bathroom. Indy looked at the screen. Her face crumpled. She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. I realized she wasn't just crying about Maverick being a predator. She was crying about her own blindness to the signs, about her guilt for bringing him into our home. She looked at me with these devastated eyes. She whispered that I tried to warn her. I had to look away because I felt guilty too. Guilty for not pushing harder months ago when I first noticed something was wrong. Detective Black pulled out a folder and opened it on the coffee table. He explained they got a warrant for Maverick's phone, his computer, and all his cloud storage accounts. The digital forensics team was already working to recover everything, including deleted files. He said the investigation would take several weeks, and we'd probably discover more bad information as they dug deeper. Then he asked if anyone in our family got strange friend requests on social media lately, or noticed anyone hanging around the house. We all looked at each other and nobody could answer. We had no idea how deep this went or who else might be involved. No. Detective Black wrote down more notes and said they'd be checking Maverick's online activity and any contacts he had. Mom started crying again, and Dad put his arm around her shoulders. The detective stood up and said he'd be in touch soon with updates. The other officers packed up their equipment from upstairs, and they all left through the front door. We sat in the living room after they were gone, and nobody said anything for a long time. The silence felt heavy and wrong. Finally, Dad cleared his throat and said we needed to make a plan to keep Thea safe and support each other through whatever came next. Scarlett wiped her eyes and her voice came out hard and steady, despite the tears still on her face. She said she was moving Thea's crib away from the window tonight and installing cameras in the nursery tomorrow. Mom nodded and suggested we all start going to family therapy together. Indy was sitting curled up in the corner of the couch, and she nodded without looking up. I could tell she was still trying to process that her first real boyfriend turned out to be a predator who used her to get access to her niece. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and replaying every single thing I'd seen between Maverick and my family over the past 6 months. Now I saw it all through this sick new lens. That late night in the kitchen when I caught him with Scarlett wasn't about planning Indy's birthday present. He was probably trying to get information about Thea's schedule or manipulate Scarlett into trusting him more. All those family dinners when he showed up even though Indy wasn't home weren't about wanting to be part of our family. He was there to have chances to see Thea and maybe take more pictures. Every friendly gesture and helpful offer was actually grooming and manipulation. I felt sick thinking about how I noticed something was wrong, but didn't see it clearly enough to stop him sooner. The next morning, I woke up to my phone going crazy with notifications. Word had spread through school about what happened. I had dozens of texts from people in my classes asking if it was true that Maverick got arrested. Some messages were supportive and said I did the right thing, but others were mean and said I probably made everything up because I was jealous of Maverick dating my sister or wanted attention. I scrolled through them, feeling worse with each one. Then I saw a message from one of Maverick's close friends. It called me a liar and said I was going to pay for ruining Maverick's life. I turned off my phone and threw it on my desk. That afternoon, Detective Black called Mom's cell and asked to talk to her on speaker so the whole family could hear. He said they finished going through Maverick's devices and the news was worse than we thought. They found over 200 images of Thea on his phone and computer. Some of the photos went back 8 months to right after he started dating Indy. They also found search history on his computer for really specific bad terms about kids that proved this wasn't just innocent picture taking. It was planned predatory behavior. The detective said he needed Scarlett to come to the police station and look at some of the images to confirm they were Thea and help figure out when each one was taken. Scarlett's face went white and she started shaking her head. Dad immediately said he'd go with her because she couldn't do that alone. They left within the hour and didn't come back for 3 hours. When they finally walked through the door, Scarlett looked like she'd aged 10 years in one afternoon. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she moved like she was in physical pain. She sat down on the couch and told us through fresh tears that some of the photos were taken from inside her bedroom while she was changing Thea's diaper. That meant Maverick had been in their private space without permission. He probably snuck in there when the rest of us thought he was just waiting for Indy downstairs in the living room. Mom made a sound like she'd been punched and Dad's hands curled into fists. Indy hadn't come out of her room since yesterday except to use the bathroom. She wasn't eating or talking to anyone. I went upstairs and knocked on her door, but she didn't answer. I sat down on the floor outside her room and talked through the wood. I told her none of this was her fault and that Maverick fooled all of us. He was good at hiding what he really was. After a few minutes, I heard movement inside and then the door opened. Indy stood there looking completely destroyed. Her hair was a mess and her eyes were swollen from crying. She said she kept remembering all the times she showed Maverick photos of Thea on her phone or talked about how cute she was. She realized now that she was feeding his sick interest without knowing it. I didn't know what to say, so I just hugged her and she cried into my shoulder. A few days later, Mom made an emergency appointment with a family therapist. We all piled into the car and drove to an office building downtown. The counselor was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calm voice. We spent an uncomfortable hour sitting in her office trying to explain what happened and how we felt about it. The therapist listened to everything and then explained that predators are really skilled at manipulation. They specifically look for families that have access to young children. She said Maverick probably chose to date Indy on purpose because she had a toddler niece living in her house. That made Indy start crying even harder because it meant her whole relationship was fake. It was never about her at all, but just a tool he used to abuse someone else. 2 weeks after that, Detective Black called again. This time he said Maverick's lawyer was trying to set up a plea deal to avoid going to trial. That meant Maverick would admit he was guilty, but try to negotiate for smaller charges and less punishment. The prosecutor wanted to meet with our family to talk about whether we'd support a plea deal or if we wanted to push for a full trial. Dad got really mad when he heard that. He said he wanted Maverick to face the maximum punishment possible and didn't want any deals. But Mom looked worried and said she didn't want to put Thea through the stress of a trial, even though she was too young to testify or understand what was happening. The next day, we all went to meet with the prosecutor at the courthouse. She was a serious woman in a dark suit who laid out our options very clearly. She explained that a trial would take a long time and be very public. All the details about Maverick's collection of photos would become part of the court record that reporters and community members could access. A plea deal would guarantee that Maverick got convicted and had to register as a sex offender for life. But it would also mean the family wouldn't have to go through months of public exposure and media attention. Scarlett sat there listening, and I could see her struggling with the choice. She wanted justice and wanted Maverick to be punished as much as possible. But she also wanted to protect Thea from having this horrible thing define her whole childhood when she got old enough to understand what happened. A few days after that meeting, we were all sitting in the living room trying to act normal when the doorbell rang. Dad got up to answer it, and I heard voices on the porch. Maverick's parents were standing there. His mom was crying, and his dad looked like he hadn't slept in days. They started talking really fast about how they needed to explain something to us. Dad stood in the doorway blocking them from coming inside. His mom kept saying Maverick made a terrible mistake, but he wasn't a monster. She said he'd been going to therapy and he was so sorry for everything. Dad's voice got really cold and quiet. He told them their son was exactly a monster and they needed to leave our property right now. Maverick's dad tried to step forward like he was going to push past Dad, but Dad put his hand on the doorframe. He said if they didn't leave in the next 30 seconds, he was calling the police. Maverick's mom started crying harder and saying we didn't understand. She said Maverick was getting help and he was just a confused kid who made bad choices. Dad said their son took pictures of a 2-year-old child and they needed to accept what he really was. They stood there on the porch for another minute trying to convince us to listen. Finally, Dad pulled out his phone and started dialing. They left after that, but I could hear his mom sobbing all the way to their car. Going back to the school after my suspension ended was horrible. Everyone knew what happened because the story had spread through the whole school. Some kids would see me in the hallway and literally cross to the other side to avoid me, like I was dangerous or something. Other kids treated me like I was some kind of hero for exposing Maverick. They'd give me these weird looks of respect that made me uncomfortable. The worst part was Maverick's friend group. They started telling people I made everything up. They said I planted the pictures on his phone because I was jealous he was dating Indy. Some of them were saying I wanted Indy for myself, which made me want to throw up. The rumor got more and more twisted as it spread. By the end of the first week back, I heard someone say I attacked Maverick because I was in love with Scarlett. That one made me so mad I couldn't see straight. I was walking past a group of Maverick's friends in the cafeteria when one of them said something about how I probably took the pictures myself. I didn't even think. I just grabbed him by his shirt and shoved him against the wall. A teacher pulled me off before I could hit him, but the damage was done. I got called to the principal's office again. She said she understood I was under stress, but fighting wasn't acceptable. I tried to explain what they were saying about me and my family, but she said I needed to walk away from situations like that. She gave me a second suspension, 3 days this time. The day after I got suspended, Detective Black called and asked if I could come to the station for another interview. Mom drove me there and we sat in the same room as before. This time, the detective had a different look on his face, more serious somehow. He started asking really specific questions about Maverick's other friends and activities. He wanted to know if Maverick spent time around other families with young kids. I told him about the youth center where Maverick volunteered on weekends. He made notes about that. Then I remembered Maverick had a part-time job at a kids' gym teaching basic sports to little kids. Detective Black's expression got darker when I said that. He asked how long Maverick had worked there and how often. I said maybe 6 months and usually 2 afternoons a week. The detective wrote everything down and thanked me. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He asked if I knew whether Maverick ever babysat for neighbors or family friends. That's when I understood what he was really asking. He wanted to know if there were other victims besides Thea. I felt sick thinking about it. I told him I didn't know about babysitting, but Maverick was always really friendly with little kids at family gatherings and stuff. Detective Black nodded like he expected that answer. He said they were following up on some leads and would be in touch. 2 weeks later, Detective Black called our house again. This time he asked to speak with my parents and Scarlett together. We all gathered in the living room, and he told us that 2 more families had come forward. After the police contacted everyone connected to Maverick's volunteer work and his job at the gym, these families reported noticing weird behavior. One mom said Maverick always volunteered to help her 4-year-old son in the bathroom at the youth center, even though other adults were available. Another family said Maverick offered to babysit their 3-year-old daughter multiple times and seemed really pushy about it. Both families said they felt uncomfortable, but dismissed it as awkward teenage behavior at the time. Now, with everything that came out about Thea, they realized it was more than that. Detective Black explained the investigation was expanding. Maverick was now facing charges related to multiple victims, not just Thea. Scarlett started crying when she heard that. Not just sad crying, but this kind of angry, relieved crying. She kept saying she felt horrible that other kids got hurt, but at least now everyone would believe how serious this was. Mom held her while she cried. Dad sat there with his hands in fists, looking like he wanted to hit something. Detective Black said the evidence was overwhelming now. With multiple victims and all the photos they found on Maverick's devices, there was no way he could claim it was a misunderstanding. A few days after that, the prosecutor called. Mom put her on speaker so we could all hear. She said Maverick's lawyer had contacted her office that morning. After the additional victims were discovered, they were withdrawing their request for a plea deal. They realized they had no leverage to negotiate anymore. The evidence was too strong and too widespread. The prosecutor said the case was definitely going to trial now. She warned us it would probably become a media thing because of the number of victims and because Maverick was only 15. Local news would likely cover it, maybe even some bigger outlets. Our family needed to decide how much we wanted to participate in the public process. Did we want to give victim impact statements at sentencing? Did we want to talk to reporters or stay anonymous? Scarlett said immediately that she wanted to give a statement. She wanted everyone to know what Maverick did and how it affected our family. But she didn't want Thea's name used anywhere. The prosecutor said they could protect Thea's identity in court documents and refer to her as a minor victim. Dad asked how long the trial would take. The prosecutor said probably several months from start to finish. First the preliminary hearing, then jury selection, then the actual trial. We all sat there quiet for a minute, processing that. Months more of this hanging over us. The next week, a woman from the Victim Advocacy Office came to our house. She introduced herself and said she was assigned to help our family through the legal process. She was probably in her 40s with kind eyes and a calm voice that made you feel like she'd seen everything before. She sat with us at the kitchen table and explained what to expect at trial. She said the media attention would be intense, but there were ways to protect our privacy. She could help us prepare statements for reporters if we wanted to talk to them, or help us avoid them if we didn't. She spent a long time with Scarlett helping her write a victim impact statement. They worked on it for hours trying to find the right words. Scarlett wanted to express how violated she felt without giving details that could identify Thea later. The advocate helped her focus on the emotional impact and the loss of feeling safe in her own home. She helped Scarlett explain what it felt like to know someone was taking pictures of her daughter without permission. By the end, they had something that felt right. Something that said everything Scarlett needed to say without exposing Thea to future problems. Meanwhile, Indy had been out of school for a week. She said she couldn't face going back after everything that happened. Mom and Dad were worried about her missing so much class, but they understood she needed time. Finally, Mom convinced her to try going back. She said she couldn't hide forever, and her teachers were being understanding about makeup work. Indy's first day back was a disaster. She came home after third period crying, so hard she could barely talk. Someone had spray-painted Snitch Family on her locker in big red letters. Kids were whispering and pointing at her in the hallways. Maverick's friends were openly hostile. One girl actually bumped into Indy on purpose and said something nasty under her breath. Indy told the principal, but by then she was so upset she couldn't stay. Mom and Dad were furious. They went to the school the next morning and demanded a meeting with the principal. They said their daughters needed better protection from harassment. The principal suspended several students who were identified as being involved with the locker vandalism and the harassment. But Indy said the damage was already done. She didn't feel safe there anymore. Even with the suspensions, she knew those kids' friends would keep targeting her. She asked if she could transfer to a different school for her senior year. Mom and Dad said they'd look into it. During my second suspension, I spent a lot of time on my laptop researching. I couldn't stop thinking about how I missed all the signs with Maverick. I wanted to understand how this could happen. I found articles about child predators and grooming behaviors. I learned that predators are really good at finding vulnerable families. They look for single parents or families going through hard times, families where there might not be as much supervision. That described us perfectly. Scarlett was a young single mom living at home. She was in college and working part-time. There were times when she needed help watching Thea. Maverick probably saw that as an opportunity. I also read that teenage predators are way more common than people think. Most people assume predators are older adults, but actually a lot of them start young. And if they don't get caught early, they usually get worse. They move on to more serious crimes. Reading that made me feel a little less guilty about not recognizing what Maverick was doing sooner. The article said predators are skilled at hiding their behavior and manipulating people's trust. But it also made me realize how important it was that I finally did something. Yeah, if I hadn't looked at his phone that day, who knows how long it would have gone on, or if he would have moved on to actually physically hurting someone. While I was suspended, Scarlett decided to install a complete security system at our house. She said she needed to feel safe again, and this was the only way. Dad helped her research different systems, and they picked one with cameras covering every door and window. They installed motion sensors in Thea's room, so if anyone came in at night, an alarm would go off. They put cameras in the hallway outside the bedrooms and in the living room. The only places without cameras were the bathrooms and inside the bedrooms themselves. It took them a whole weekend to install everything. I helped run wires and mount cameras. Working on it seemed to make both Dad and Scarlett feel better, like they were taking control of something, doing something concrete to protect the family. Thea had no idea what was going on. She just played with her toys and watched us work. Sometimes she'd try to help by handing us tools or holding a flashlight. Scarlett watched her the whole time with this intense look on her face, like she was memorizing every detail of her daughter being safe and happy. It broke my heart seeing her that way. 6 weeks after Maverick got arrested, we all went to the preliminary hearing. The prosecutor said we didn't have to be there, but we wanted to show support. We all dressed up and drove to the courthouse together. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. There were rows of benches and a judge's bench at the front. We sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table. Maverick came in through a side door with his lawyer. He was wearing dress pants and a button-up shirt that looked too big on him. His hands were cuffed in front of him. He looked smaller somehow, younger. Nothing like the confident guy who used to joke around at our dinner table and tease me about dating my sister. When he walked past our row, his eyes met mine for just a second. I saw fear in his face, and shame. But I didn't see any remorse. He didn't look sorry for what he did. He just looked sorry he got caught. The judge came in and everyone stood up. Then the hearing started. The prosecutor presented evidence about the photos found on Maverick's phone and computer. She talked about the multiple victims and the pattern of behavior. Maverick's lawyer tried to argue that some of the evidence should be thrown out, but the judge wasn't having it. After about an hour, the judge said there was enough evidence for the case to go to trial. She set a trial date 4 months away. Maverick's bail was set really high. His parents couldn't afford it, so he'd stay in juvenile detention until trial. As they led him away, his mom started sobbing really loud. She was sitting across the aisle from us, and she turned and glared at our whole family. Like we were the bad guys in this. Like we'd done something wrong by reporting what her son did. I felt angry seeing that look on her face. How could she not see what her son really was? Throat tight with anger as we walked out of that courtroom. I couldn't understand how she blamed us instead of seeing what her son had done to innocent kids. Dad put his hand on my shoulder as we headed to the parking lot and told me to let it go, that some people would never accept the truth about their own family. That night, we drove to an Italian restaurant across town where nobody knew us. It was the first time in months we'd all sat down together without lawyers or police or therapists. Thea was in a high chair at the end of the table, grabbing fistfuls of spaghetti and smearing sauce all over her face and hands. She laughed every time a noodle slipped through her fingers. Scarlett kept wiping her down with napkins, but gave up after the third try to just let her make a mess. Indy actually smiled watching Thea play with her food. It was the first real smile I'd seen on her face in weeks. Mom ordered wine for the adults and Dad raised his glass when everyone had their drinks. He said he wanted to make a toast to our family's strength and how we'd gotten through something terrible together. His voice cracked a little when he talked about how proud he was of all of us. We clinked glasses, and for a few minutes it felt almost normal again, like we were just a regular family having dinner. The waitress brought out our food, and we ate and talked about simple things like Indy's upcoming history test and Scarlett's college classes. Nobody mentioned Maverick or the trial or what came next. We just existed together in that moment and let ourselves feel okay. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with texts from people at the school. The local news had covered the sentencing, and they'd used our family's full names in the report. I turned on the TV and saw the courthouse steps where we'd stood yesterday, then a photo of Maverick from before his arrest. The reporter talked about the multiple victims and the plea deal, and mentioned that the Burke family had been instrumental in the investigation. Mom's phone started ringing within an hour. Some calls were from friends offering support, but others were from people in the community with opinions about how we'd handled everything. A few said we should have pushed for a trial and maximum sentence instead of accepting a deal. Others said we were brave for protecting the victims from a public trial. Mom stopped answering after the 10th call and just let it go to voicemail. Scarlett had it worse. She went to the grocery store that afternoon to pick up diapers for Thea, and 3 different people approached her in the aisles. One woman told her she was doing the right thing by speaking up. Another asked why she'd let Maverick around her daughter in the first place, like it was somehow Scarlett's fault for not knowing he was a predator. A man she'd never met cornered her by the checkout and said the plea deal was too soft and that Maverick would be out hurting kids again in a few years. Scarlett came home shaking with anger and threw the grocery bags on the counter. She told us she was done going out in public for a while because she couldn't handle strangers acting like they had any right to judge how she protected her daughter. I went back to the school on Monday and immediately felt the difference in how people looked at me. Before the arrest, I'd been known as the kid who attacked his friend in class. Now I was the kid who exposed a predator. Some of my teachers pulled me aside to say they were proud of me for speaking up, even though it cost me a friendship. My English teacher told me I'd done something incredibly brave, and that she hoped her own kids would have the courage to do the same if they ever saw something wrong. But other teachers seemed uncomfortable around me, like I was a reminder of something dark they'd rather not think about. My history teacher barely made eye contact with me anymore, and my gym coach stopped calling on me in class. The students were split too. Maverick's close friends wanted nothing to do with me and spread rumors that I'd made everything up because I was jealous. They avoided me in the hallways, and one of them shoulder-checked me on purpose between classes. But other students started sitting with me at lunch, kids I'd never really talked to before. Most of them had their own stories about trauma or abuse or family problems. They understood what I'd been through in a way my old friends never could. One girl told me her uncle had been arrested for similar stuff when she was younger, and she knew how hard it was to be the person who spoke up. Another guy said his sister had been in an abusive relationship, and he wished he'd noticed the signs earlier like I had. My whole friendship group had changed completely, but I realized these new friends understood me better than the old ones ever did. Indy made a decision at dinner one night that she wanted to switch schools for her senior year. She said she couldn't handle being known as the girlfriend of that predator everywhere she went. Every time someone looked at her, she wondered if they were thinking about Maverick and judging her for not seeing what he was. Mom and Dad talked it over and agreed to help her enroll in a neighboring district where she could finish high school without constant reminders. It took 2 weeks to get all the paperwork sorted and transfer her records. On her last day at our school, she found me in the hallway after 6th period. She hugged me hard and thanked me for protecting our family, even when it cost me my best friend. She said she knew I'd tried to warn her about Maverick months ago, and she wished she'd listened. I told her it wasn't her fault that he'd fooled all of us. We stood there for a minute, just holding on to each other, and I realized our relationship had changed through all this. We'd always been close as siblings, but now there was a deeper understanding between us. We'd survived something terrible together and come out stronger. She pulled back and wiped her eyes and said she'd see me at home. I watched her walk down the hallway toward the exit and hoped her fresh start would give her the peace she deserved. Scarlett announced a month later that she was moving out of our family home. She'd found a small 2-bedroom apartment across town and said she needed space that didn't carry memories of Maverick's violation. Every room in our house reminded her of times he'd been there, places he might have taken photos of Thea without anyone knowing. She needed walls that felt clean and safe. The whole family helped her move on a Saturday morning. Dad rented a truck, and we loaded up her furniture and boxes of clothes and Thea's toys. The new apartment was on the second floor of a quiet building with a security entrance. Dad spent the whole afternoon installing an even more advanced security system than the one at our house. He put cameras at her front door and motion sensors on all the windows. He installed special locks that could only be opened from inside and set up an alarm that would alert his phone if anything was wrong. Scarlett watched him work with this determined look on her face, like she was reclaiming control over her life. I helped her set up Thea's new room, painting one wall with chalkboard paint so Thea could draw on it when she got older. Scarlett stood in the doorway watching me paint, and I could see how much stronger she'd become. She wasn't the person who second-guessed her instincts anymore. She'd been transformed into someone who trusted her gut completely and would do anything to keep her daughter safe. 6 months after Maverick's arrest, our family had a check-in session with our therapist. She asked each of us to talk about how we'd grown and what we'd learned. Dad went first and said he'd become more present and attentive to warning signs instead of assuming the best in people. He admitted he'd wanted to believe Maverick was a good kid because that was easier than facing the alternative. Now he paid closer attention to behavior patterns and trusted his discomfort when something felt off. Mom talked about learning to trust her own feelings instead of dismissing them as anxiety or overprotection. She said she'd noticed Maverick's excessive interest in Thea early on, but told herself she was being paranoid. Now she knew that maternal instinct existed for a reason, and she wouldn't ignore it again. Scarlett shared that she'd enrolled in criminal justice classes at community college. She wanted to work with child protection services someday and help other families recognize predatory behavior before it was too late. She said turning her trauma into purpose was the only way she could make sense of what happened. Indy told us she'd become an advocate for teen dating violence awareness at her new school. She'd started a support group for students in unhealthy relationships and helped 3 girls recognize manipulation tactics their boyfriends were using. She said helping others see what she'd missed made her feel like something good could come from her pain. I sat there listening to my family share their growth and realized I'd changed too. I'd become more observant and protective, but also more aware that justice and healing were complicated. At 15, I'd seen everything in black and white, but now I understood that stopping a predator doesn't erase the trauma they caused. Healing isn't something you finish and move on from. It's something you work at every day. I'd learned that doing the right thing sometimes means making everyone uncomfortable, including yourself. Speaking up about Maverick had destroyed my friendship group and gotten me suspended and made my family's private pain public. But it had also stopped him from hurting more kids and given our family a chance to heal together. I'd learned that protecting people you love is worth any social cost. The black and white thinking I'd had before was gone now, replaced with understanding that real life is messy and painful and complicated. But even with all that complexity, I knew I'd make the same choice again. Seeing those photos on Maverick's phone and choosing to act instead of look away was the moment I became someone I could respect. Detective Black called our house one evening with a final update. He said his team had identified all of Maverick's known victims and notified their families. There were 7 kids total, ranging from 18 months to 4 years old. A special task force had been working with tech companies to remove the distributed images from online platforms. He couldn't promise they'd gotten everything because the internet makes things permanent in ways that are hard to fight. But they'd taken down hundreds of copies and flagged the images so they'd be removed automatically if they surfaced again. He thanked our family for our cooperation throughout the investigation. He said our willingness to pursue justice despite the personal cost had helped protect other potential victims. If we hadn't spoken up when we did, Maverick might have escalated to physical abuse or found new victims. Scarlett cried on the phone with relief, knowing he was locked away and unable to hurt anyone else. At least for now. At least until he turned 21 and got released. But that was years away, and she'd use that time to make sure Thea grew up strong and safe and loved. Thea turned 3 years old, and we threw her a birthday party at Scarlett's new apartment. Scarlett decorated the living room with streamers and balloons and set up a small table with a cake shaped like a butterfly. Thea wore a purple dress and a paper crown and ran around showing everyone her new toys. She had no idea what we were really celebrating. This wasn't just another birthday. It was proof that she was thriving and happy and completely unaware of the darkness that had touched her life before she could form memories. She would never remember Maverick or the violation or the fear. She would grow up knowing only that her family loved her and protected her. We sang happy birthday, and Thea blew out her candles with help from Scarlett. She got frosting all over her face and laughed when Dad pretended to steal a piece of her cake. I watched her playing with Indy and Mom and felt this sense of purpose about everything that had happened. The choice I'd made that day in health class had led to this moment. A little girl celebrating her 3rd birthday surrounded by family who fought to keep her safe. That made all the pain and loss and difficulty worth it. Indy brought her new boyfriend to meet the family a few weeks later, and we were all on high alert from the second he walked through the door. Dad shook his hand and held on a little too long while staring into his eyes. Mom asked him 100 questions about his family and his plans and his values. Scarlett watched him interact with Thea, and I could see her analyzing every movement and expression. We were all looking for red flags and warning signs because we knew now what we'd missed before. But he seemed genuinely kind and respectful. He pulled out Indy's chair at dinner and asked thoughtful questions about our lives. He knew about what had happened with Maverick because Indy had told him everything up front. He understood why we were protective and didn't get defensive about our scrutiny. After dinner, Dad pulled me aside in the kitchen while everyone else was in the living room. He put his hand on my shoulder and told me he was grateful I was the kind of brother who paid attention and spoke up even when it was hard. He said I'd earned a new level of respect in our family, and he trusted my judgment about people. I looked through the doorway at Indy laughing with her new boyfriend and felt hopeful that maybe she'd found someone decent this time, someone who would treat her right, and if he didn't, I'd be watching. A year passed and we marked the anniversary of the arrest with a quiet family dinner at our house. Nobody said the actual date out loud, but we all knew why we were gathered. Dad grilled steaks in the backyard while Mom set the table with our nice dishes. Indy brought her boyfriend and Scarlett brought Thea, who was 3 now, and talking in full sentences. We ate and talked about normal things like work and school, and Thea's new words. After dessert, Scarlett pulled out her phone and showed us photos she'd been taking to track Thea's development. There was Thea learning to use a spoon, Thea playing with blocks, Thea laughing at the park. Mom cried looking at them and said how normal and happy she looked. Dad raised his glass and said we'd all been changed by what happened, but we weren't broken. Scarlett nodded and squeezed his hand. I looked around the table at my family and felt this weird mix of sadness and pride. We'd survived something terrible together and come out the other side still intact. That night I started writing about everything that had happened. My English teacher assigned a personal essay, and I decided to write about discovering a friend was a predator and what came after. I changed all the names and left out details that could identify anyone. I wrote about the confusion of noticing warning signs but not trusting them, the sick feeling of seeing those photos, the chaos of the arrest and investigation, the guilt and anger and slow healing. It took me 3 weeks to finish because I kept having to stop and cry or take breaks. When I turned it in, my teacher kept me after class. She said it was powerful and honest and asked if she could submit it to a youth writing contest. I said yes because maybe it would help someone else recognize the signs I'd missed. 3 months later, I got a call saying I'd won first place. The prize was $500 and publication in a national magazine. It felt weird to win something for writing about the worst experience of my life. The magazine came out in the spring, and suddenly people were reading my words. Letters started arriving at the magazine office, and they forwarded them to me. Teenagers from all over the country writing to say they'd experienced similar situations. Girls who'd dated guys with creepy behavior toward younger siblings. Guys who'd reported friends for predatory actions and lost their whole social circle. Kids who felt guilty for not speaking up sooner. I answered every letter I could, and each one reminded me that staying silent would have been worse than the pain of speaking up. Indy graduated from her new high school in June with honors and a scholarship to study social work. She'd transformed herself completely over the past 2 years. Her grades went from average to excellent. She joined clubs and made new friends who didn't know about the Maverick situation. She got accepted to 3 different colleges and chose the one with the best victim advocacy program. At her graduation party in our backyard, she stood on a chair and gave a speech thanking everyone for coming. She talked about how the past 2 years had been the hardest of her life, but also the most important. She said our family had supported her through the darkest period and helped her find a sense of purpose. Then she looked right at me and said I'd been willing to lose my best friend to protect our family, and that kind of courage inspired her every day. I felt my eyes fill up and my throat get tight. I tried to hold it together, but tears started running down my face. I had to leave the backyard and go inside to the bathroom where I cried for 10 minutes straight. Mom found me there and hugged me without saying anything. When I came back outside, Indy hugged me too and whispered thank you in my ear. Scarlett finished her associate degree that summer and got accepted into a bachelor's program for criminal justice. She wanted to specialize in child protection and work with families dealing with predators. She'd been dating someone new for a few months. He worked as a police officer in the next county over and understood why she was so focused on safety and boundaries. I met him at a family barbecue and watched how he interacted with Thea. He was careful and appropriate. He asked Scarlett before picking Thea up. He respected when Thea said she didn't want to play a game. Scarlett seemed happy in a way I hadn't seen since before everything happened. She smiled more and laughed easier. Watching her rebuild her life with confidence and purpose made me proud. She'd taken her trauma and turned it into motivation to help other families avoid what we went through. 2 years after the arrest, I was 17 and filling out college applications. I decided to study psychology with a focus on adolescent development and trauma. The experience with discovering what kind of person someone really was had changed how I understood human behavior. I wanted to learn why predators targeted certain victims and how to spot warning signs earlier. I'd started volunteering with a youth crisis hotline 6 months earlier. I took calls 3 nights a week from teenagers dealing with abuse and betrayal and manipulation. My own experience helped me connect with callers in ways the training manual couldn't teach. I knew what it felt like to discover someone you trusted was dangerous. I knew the guilt of wondering if you could have stopped it sooner. I knew the isolation of having people not believe you. When kids called the hotline scared and confused, I could tell them honestly that speaking up was worth it, even when it cost everything. Our family had reached a new normal that was different from before, but stable. We talked more openly about feelings and fears. We asked each other direct questions instead of hoping problems would resolve themselves. We'd learned that protecting each other sometimes meant having uncomfortable conversations and trusting instincts even when they seemed paranoid. Thea was 4 years old now and thriving. She had no memory of what happened when she was 2. She didn't know about the photos or the trial or the man who'd violated her privacy. She just knew she was loved and safe and surrounded by family who would do anything to protect her. That was exactly what we'd fought for. I ran into one of Maverick's old friends at a community event in the fall. He was working at a booth for the youth center, and I almost walked past without acknowledging him. But he called my name and came over looking awkward and uncomfortable. He said he wanted to apologize for not believing me at first and for participating in the harassment campaign after the arrest. He said he'd been wrong and stupid and he was sorry. Then he told me something that surprised me. Several of his friends had recognized predatory behavior in their own relationships after what happened with Maverick, and they'd gotten help or reported it. 2 guys had reported adult coaches who were grooming younger players. One girl had turned in her boyfriend for having inappropriate photos of his younger cousin. The whole situation had opened people's eyes to warning signs they'd been ignoring. It was a small piece of good in a story full of pain, but it mattered. Something positive had come from speaking up, even though it had been terrible at the time. Looking back on everything that happened, I understand now that the moment I saw those photos on Maverick's phone and chose to act instead of look away was the moment I became someone I could respect. I could have pretended I didn't see them. I could have convinced myself it was none of my business. I could have talked to Maverick privately and given him a chance to delete the evidence and find new victims. Instead, I swung at him in front of a classroom full of witnesses and a police officer. The fight and the investigation and the trial and the healing were all hard. There were days I wished I'd never looked at his phone and stayed ignorant. Days when the harassment from his friends made me want to transfer schools. Days when I felt guilty for not acting sooner or noticing the signs faster. But it was worth it because Thea is safe and our family is stronger. We learned how to protect each other and trust our instincts and have difficult conversations. I learned that protecting people you love isn't always dramatic or heroic. Sometimes it's just choosing to pay attention when it would be easier to look away. Trusting your gut when everyone tells you you're paranoid. Speaking up even when it costs you your best friend and your reputation and your sense of safety. The photos I saw that day in health class changed everything, but they also clarified everything. I knew exactly who Maverick really was and exactly what I needed to do about it. There was no confusion or doubt or second guessing, just clarity and action and consequences. That moment defined me more than anything else in my teenage years, and I wouldn't change it even knowing how hard everything that followed would be.